Welcome to Creepy Corner Stories, where the shadows whisper and the unknown lurks just beyond the trees. Forests have always held secrets, some beautiful, some terrifying. For centuries, people have vanished without a trace. Eerie lights have flickered between the trees, and something not quite human has been heard calling from the depths of the woods. Tonight, we step into the darkness, into the heart of the unknown. Are you ready to hear the tales that make even the bravest souls afraid of the forest? Stay close, because once you enter, there's no telling what might be watching you. Let's begin. Story: The Whistler in the Woods. There's a rule in Black Hollow Forest: never whistle at night. Most people in town shrug it off as just another local superstition, except for those who have heard it. Jason learned the hard way. He was hiking alone, the last rays of sunlight filtering through the trees as he set up camp. The air was still, almost too still. Not a single bird chirped, not a single leaf rustled. The silence pressed down on him. Feeling uneasy, he tried to shake it off. Just the quiet of nature, he told himself. As a joke, he puckered his lips and whistled a short, three-note tune. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, deep within the forest, something whistled back. Jason froze. It was the same three-note tune, mimicked perfectly, but the voice behind it was wrong. Too smooth, too hollow, as if the forest itself had repeated it. He turned, scanning the tree line. Shadows stretched unnaturally long. A figure stood just beyond the reach of his lantern light. Tall, thin, and grinning. The thing whistled again. Jason ran. His heart pounded as he crashed through the underbrush, branches clawing at his clothes. But no matter how fast he ran, the whistling was always just behind him. When he finally stumbled out of the forest and onto the road, gasping for air, the sound stopped. He turned back. Nothing was there. The next morning, rangers found his abandoned campsite. His tent was torn open, his gear scattered. The only clue left behind, a piece of bark carved with 3 simple notes. And if you listen closely at night in Black Hollow Forest, you might still hear the whistler calling for someone new. Story: The Shadow in the Pines. Deep in the Ravenwood Forest, there's a path that no one dares walk after sunset. The locals call it the Hollow Trail, and they warn, if you hear footsteps behind you, keep walking. If you feel breath on your neck, do not turn around. Emma had never believed in ghost stories. She was a photographer, drawn to the eerie beauty of forgotten places. So when she heard about Ravenwood's haunted path, she packed her camera and set off to prove the legends were nothing but old tales. The forest was dense, the towering pines swallowing the last traces of daylight. As she walked, the silence unnerved her. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of leaves under her boots. Then another crunch. Emma stopped. The sound had come from behind her. She turned quickly, nothing but trees. Shaking off her nerves, she continued. Crunch. This time, closer. She spun around. The path was empty, but something had changed. The trees, they seemed tighter together. Their branches stretched like clawed fingers. A chill crept up her spine. She lifted her camera and snapped a picture. The flash lit up the path for only a second. But in that second, she saw it. A tall, shapeless figure standing among the trees. Its face was wrong, twisted, shifting, as if it was made of shadows. Emma ran. She didn't care about the photos, didn't care about the legends. She only cared about getting out. The footsteps behind her quickened. Closer, closer. Just before she reached the end of the trail, she felt breath on the back of her neck, cold, heavy. She stumbled onto the road, gasping for air. The forest was silent again. Emma never spoke of that night, but when she developed the photos later, the last image showed the path, the trees, and behind her, a figure made of darkness stretching toward her with impossibly long fingers. She deleted the photo. But sometimes when she's alone at night, she swears she can hear footsteps. Creeping closer. Story: The Hungry Trees. In the heart of Blackwood Forest, there's a place known as the Silent Grove, a patch of trees where no birds sing, no wind blows, and the air always feels just a little too thick. Locals say the forest there is alive, not just with roots and leaves, but with something hungrier. No one believed the stories more than old Mr. Halloway. He was the town's oldest resident and the last person who had seen what lay deep inside the grove. One evening, a group of teenagers dared each other to prove the legends wrong. Armed with flashlights and bravado, they trekked into Blackwood, laughing off the warnings. As they approached the silent grove, the air changed. The laughter faded. The trees, once spaced apart, now seemed to press in closer. The deeper they went, the more they noticed something odd. The trees looked wrong. Their bark wasn't rough, but smooth, like stretched skin. Then Jason, the bravest of the group, pointed at something near the base of a massive oak, a handprint. It was embedded into the bark, fingers splayed as if someone had pressed against the tree with all their strength. The deeper they looked, the worse it got, faces faintly visible in the wood, twisted in silent screams. That's when they heard it, a deep, low creaking, as if the trees were breathing. Then, a whisper. "Stay with us." The ground lurched beneath them, roots curling like fingers. A gnarled branch shot down, wrapping around Jason's wrist. He screamed, struggling, but the bark swallowed his hand up to the wrist in seconds. The others grabbed him, pulling with everything they had. The tree pulled back. Then crack! Jason fell backward, gasping. His friends dragged him away, sprinting toward town without ever looking back. The next morning, Jason sat pale and silent on his porch, staring at his hand. The skin was rough, hardened. A patch of bark had spread across his palm, like the tree had left a piece of itself inside him. He never spoke of the silent grove again. And years later, when Jason mysteriously disappeared, his friends knew where to find him. Somewhere, deep in the forest, a new tree had grown. One with bark so smooth, it almost looked like human skin. Story: The Thing in the Fog. They say the Red Hollow woods breathe at night. When the fog rolls in, it slithers low to the ground, curling around trees like fingers, creeping into every shadow. That's when it comes out. Danny didn't believe the stories. He was just passing through the small town, looking for a quiet place to camp before continuing his road trip. The old man at the gas station warned him, though. "Stay out of the woods after dark, son. When the fog comes, you ain't alone." Danny just laughed it off and hiked in anyway. By the time he set up camp, the fog had already begun creeping in, thick and heavy. It muffled the sounds of the forest, swallowing his breath as he exhaled. Everything was still, too still. Then he heard it, a soft, dragging sound. Something was moving just beyond the fog, its footsteps slow, deliberate. Danny shined his flashlight toward the sound, but the beam barely cut through the dense mist. He squinted. A figure stood just ahead, tall, unnaturally thin. Its arms too long, swaying slightly. Then it moved, not like a person, not like anything that should be able to move on two legs. It jerked forward in sharp, unnatural motions, stopping and starting as if it were glitching through reality. Danny's breath hitched. The figure tilted its head toward him. Then it whispered, "I see you." Danny ran. He didn't care about his tent, his gear, he just ran. But the fog was thick, the trees unfamiliar. The dragging sound grew louder, closer. The thing wasn't chasing him. It was waiting. Suddenly, the ground vanished beneath him. He tumbled down a sharp drop, hitting the ground hard. His head spun, vision blurring as he looked up. The fog thinned for just a second, and he saw it. Standing at the edge of the hill, staring down at him. Its face was featureless, just a smooth, pale oval, but Danny could feel it staring. Then the fog swallowed it again. By the time he stumbled back into town, it was nearly dawn. The fog had lifted, the forest looked normal, but Danny didn't feel normal. His shadow stretched a little too far. His reflection in the motel mirror seemed to move a second too late, and sometimes when the night was quiet, he swore he could still hear it. "I see you." Story: The Eyes in the Trees. There's an old legend about Grayson Forest, a warning passed down for generations. If you see the eyes, don't run. If you hear them blink, it's already too late. No one knows who started the story, but people go missing there. No bodies, no traces, just empty tents and unanswered questions. Sam and his friends didn't believe in ghost stories. They were seasoned campers, looking for a weekend of beer and campfire stories. The warnings didn't scare them, but they should have. The first night was normal, crackling flames, laughter, the distant hoot of an owl. But around 2 a.m. something changed. The woods went silent, no wind, no insects, just thick, suffocating stillness. Then a sound, blink, a wet, deliberate blink. Sam sat up, his breath caught in his throat, his flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trees. Then he saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them, high in the branches, watching. Too large to be animal eyes, too still to belong to anything human. The other campers stirred, whispering, confused. Then the eyes moved. Not the way eyes should. They slid, shifting position without a sound, as if whatever owned them wasn't climbing, but slithering through the trees. Then another sound. Blink, blink, blink. The eyes multiplied. One of Sam's friends bolted. A mistake. The moment he ran, the eyes dropped from the trees. A black shape, too fast to see clearly, lunged from the branches. The friend's scream cut short. A sickening crunch, then silence. The rest of them stood frozen, too afraid to breathe. The eyes turned back toward them. Sam's fingers trembled as he grabbed his knife, but deep down he knew it wouldn't matter. Then, the eyes did something worse than watch. They smiled, a jagged, splitting grin stretching wide in the darkness. Sam didn't remember how they made it out. He only remembered running, the feeling of something unseen brushing past him, the distant sound of blinking fading into the trees. By sunrise, they were back at their car. His friend was never found. And when Sam tried to tell the police what happened, they only gave him a knowing look and said, "You saw them, didn't you?" Now Sam doesn't go near forests anymore, because sometimes, even in his own home, when the night is dark and the silence is heavy, he swears he hears it. Blink. Story: The Thing That Wore Her Face. The Deepwood Forest has always been a place of vanishings. People wander in and never come out. Those who do escape come back wrong. Lena and her brother Mark grew up hearing the stories. Their grandmother always warned them, if you hear your own voice in the woods, run. It's not you. They laughed it off, until the night they learned the truth. One autumn evening, they decided to camp near the old ranger station, just for fun. The night air was crisp, the fire warm, and the trees loomed like silent watchers. Around midnight, Lena left the tent to use the bathroom. The woods were deathly quiet, no wind, no rustling leaves, just stillness. Then she heard it. Lena, a whisper, close. She spun around. No one was there. The voice came again, this time from deeper in the woods. Lena, come here. It was her own voice. Her stomach turned to ice. Slowly, she stepped backward toward the tent. Then footsteps, crunch, crunch. Something was walking toward her, just beyond the tree line. The moonlight barely touched the figure, but she saw enough. It was her. A perfect copy, same face, same clothes, but wrong. Its mouth stretched just a little too wide, its eyes too black, and it was smiling. Come closer, it said, its voice an eerie, hollow copy of her own. Lena bolted for the tent, shaking Mark awake. There's something out there, she gasped. Mark groggily sat up just as the zipper of the tent started to move. Something was trying to get in. But Lena was right next to him. They both froze. A whisper came from the other side of the thin fabric. Let me in. It's cold out here. Lena clapped a hand over her mouth to stop from screaming. Then, silence. They sat there, heartbeats pounding until the first light of dawn. When they finally got the courage to peek outside, there were footprints. They circled the tent over and over but never led away. They packed and ran, leaving everything behind. Lena doesn't talk about that night, but sometimes late at night when she's alone she hears it again. Lena, let me in, and she knows it never left. Story: The Tree That Eats. In the heart of Black Veil Forest, there is a single twisted oak that stands taller than the rest. Its bark is blackened, its roots stretch deep, and its branches never lose their leaves. Locals call it the hungry tree. No one knows how old it is, only that people who touch it disappear. Ethan didn't believe in ghost stories. When his friends dared him to visit the tree at night, he laughed and took the challenge. Armed with a flashlight and a cocky grin, he ventured into the woods alone. The deeper he walked, the quieter the world became. No wind, no crickets, just silence. Then he saw it. The tree was massive, its bark cracked and gnarled like folded skin. The roots swelled from the ground like twisted fingers, gripping the earth too tightly. Carved into the trunk were names, hundreds of them. Some old and weathered, others fresh as if written yesterday. Ethan reached out to trace one. The bark felt warm. A shiver crawled up his spine. He pulled his hand back, only to see something move in the bark. A finger. It pressed outward from inside the tree. then another, and another. Ethan staggered back as a face emerged from the wood, its mouth open in a silent scream, its eyes wide with terror. More faces shifted beneath the bark, as if hundreds of people were trapped inside, their bodies twisted and stretched within the trunk. Then he felt it. The roots moved. They curled around his ankles before he could run, pulling him down. The ground beneath him split open, revealing a dark, pulsing hole lined with jagged, tooth-like roots. Ethan screamed as he was dragged in. The last thing he saw was the tree's bark closing over him, sealing him inside. The next morning, his friends came looking for him. They found his flashlight near the tree, but no sign of Ethan, just a fresh name carved into the bark. And if you listen closely at night, standing near the hungry tree, you can hear muffled screams from deep inside. And so, as the whispers of the forest fade into the night, we are left wondering, how many of these stories are mere legends, and how many are warnings? The woods hold secrets, some we may never understand, some we were never meant to. But one thing is certain, if you ever find yourself alone in the forest, listen closely. You might not be as alone as you think. If you enjoyed these tales of terror, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Unless you prefer to be caught off guard, just like those who never made it out of the woods. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and whatever you do, don't stray too far from the path.